Operating expenses, tenant share of cost of operating the building based upon their proportionate share of occupancy. These costs should include reasonable cost to manage, maintain, operate, and repair the building. From a tenant side, you want to protect from allowing the landlord to use the operating expense budget as a profit center, charge more than they should customarily. On Bank of America, and I still have that today, we had an operating list of exclusions, which sophisticated landlords, you could send that out, with an RFP. With a less sophisticated, that was probably not advisable because it hung up the deal way too early. But you should know the basic ones. I mean, it's good to know and to understand those. In some, I won't go through the whole list, but depreciation, ground rent, debt service, salaries of employees beyond the level of property manager, landlord overhead related not to the building. We've all heard horror stories about, a gardener at somebody's landlord's house, being passed through as an operating expense. Cost, not you, of course, but as small as cost of complying with laws in effect at the time of lease commencement, brokerage fees, marketing costs, none of those should be passed through. Now, when you get to capital expenditures, they should be amortized over their useful life according to generally accepted accounting principles.
Can we talk about CapEx for a second? Because that's one of the really heavily negotiated provisions in an OpEx clause. Is it fair for the landlord to put a new roof on the building and pass that cost through to the tenant? Probably not. So one of the things you do, and again, on the tenant side, is you say, your lead position is you don't get to pass through any CapEx to us at all. Not fair. You shouldn't be doing it. Now, the landlord's going to come back and say, well, there's two categories of CapEx I should be able to pass through to you. Again, if the local government authority comes in and says you have to install this particular type of fire detection system in the building, it's the law. So it's mandated by governmental authority, then you have to do it. It's a cost of being in the business. So if you, the tenant, actually own the building, which essentially you do as a tenant, you have an estate in the land, under those circumstances, it's probably not unfair for the landlord to say, that's a CapEx I get to put through to you. It's not unreasonable for you to pay that. You're going to pay it at an amortized rate. So that's the one CapEx that you probably have to concede on the tenant side. The other CapEx pass through that is not unfair is if the CapEx expenditure is going to lower another component of operating expenses. So for example, if the landlord can put in a giant trash compactor system, that's going to lower the cost of waste management coming to the building and taking trash away, then it's not unfair for the landlord to say, hey, you can pay more money to have the trash removed from the building, or I can put this new system in, you can pay your proportionate share, amortized down, and that'll lower operating expenses. So those are the two components of CapEx that on the tenant side, on the landlord side, I'm willing to concede, on the tenant side, I'm willing to concede it gets passed through. But otherwise, passing through CapEx is probably not the most equitable thing to do.
So the argument of a new chiller to reduce utility expenses would be a dicey one.
HVAC is really, really tough because again, is it really going to reduce operating expenses, or is it that the chiller's worn out? Again, or you're putting in a very sophisticated monitoring system for HVAC, because you're doing one of these contracts with Johnson Controls or Honeywell, and it's $500,000 worth of these computer systems to put in. That's a CapEx thing. Is that truly going to? HVAC is a really tough one. So when I'm on the tenant side, I actually try to, if I've got a really significant tenant, say, you can put through CapEx, but I have a couple of categories where you're excluding things. HVAC, security monitoring systems, video systems, there's video security things. I can't remember what else I have on the list, but there are a couple of things you got to think about as to are those really going to reduce operating expenses? So Pike brings up a really important exception to that rule.
Here again, property managers, if there is such a provision, you have to know about it, and you have to know to bill the tenants appropriately. So I know you're doing a lobby renovation in one of your buildings. Is that something that you would expect to be able to pass through the amortization piece?
No, but it's a good idea. No, that would not be a reasonable expectation. But if I can comment and piggyback on what both you and George have talked about, I think one of the, maybe not, we can talk about it afterwards, but one of the broader trends that is happening in our industry certainly is the movement for energy efficiency and more green buildings. Now, I'm not talking necessarily LEED, but as we go into this new period where it's going to be, I think it's going to be a mandate. I don't know how you handle your clients up in California, but there's going to be more legislation surrounding higher energy efficiency, which I think is overall good. But it's going to be, I think, a larger dispute in the lease negotiations of whether that is advertised or not. Another factor I know that we're doing at TA is to inject language within the operating expense portion of these leases, at least to be able to collect the energy consumption data for the various tenants. Not necessarily germane for most office users, but more germane for the industrial manufacturing users who may see that as a competitive advantage. And landlords typically just want to get that information to figure out what systems are best to be applied in that building to make it more energy efficient, so that we can lower costs for everybody and eventually adhere to higher standards of energy usage. And I think we've initiated that over the last 2 years. It's something we've actually got a lot of pushback on, particularly in our industrial sector. But that's really I think that you'll see more landlords having to do that based on new regulation and law.
So, Mark, a question for you. Let's take a look at a flex building on a triple net lease. You've got existing package units on the roof, and the lease reads that you're not only responsible for repair and maintenance, but also replacement. What's your position on that?
Well, I want to, first thing I'm going to do is ask the landlord to be responsible for that. That's not always successful. The next thing I would do is I want to get the information on the units. How old are they? What the condition are they in? What's their useful life? Their operating history? So I know how much of a risk it is. But something done recently in one of our projects in Jacksonville was a very similar situation. And the way they worked that out was the landlord said the tenant was responsible for doing a service maintenance contract. So it was, maintained on a regular basis. But in the event of a major repair, and that can be defined, needs to be defined, or replacement, the landlord would pay for it, but then the tenant would pay back on a monthly basis an amortized amount based on the useful life. Now, if there's a year left in their lease, they pay that for a year and then they'd stop. But that seems like a pretty fair for both ways to address that.
When I'm on the landlord side in that instance, my retort is, if you run your air unit at 60 degrees 24/7, I have no control over that because you have a separate meter, a separate air. Why would I be responsible for replacing, inappropriate use? So I think there's two sides to the story.
Sure.
Yeah. How was that? Did I do a good job?
I would say from the tenant side, there are three things just real quick on that topic, and that's that you want to protect your tenant. You want to go find out what the operating expenses were, the actual for the last 3 years. You can see patterns and see if there's any issues that need to be addressed up front. You certainly want to negotiate a right to audit the landlord's books, so if there's some discrepancy, you can address that. And you want to negotiate, whenever possible, a cap on annual increases in expenses. And typically, a landlord will only allow you to do the controllable expenses, excluding real estate taxes, insurance, and utilities. But again, you're addressing the risk as best you can.
Snow removal is also uncontrollable.
Thanks for adding that, George.